Hello and welcome to the Museum of Craft and Design. It is so nice to see everyone and thank you for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. If you're new to the Museum of Craft and Design, we've been around since 2004. We've been in this building since 2013. That's the first time there's ever been a loud humming noise in the back room, so thank you for bearing with us as we quickly pivoted. We're really excited to welcome over the past 3 weeks our new executive director, Masha Barrett, who I'm going to shout out. It has been a whirlwind of a first 3 weeks to start with us, and she has rolled with the punches and stayed even-keeled throughout. So thank you, Masha. We appreciate you so much. Welcome. I couldn't be more excited to be here with these 3 artists and with Sarah Mills. Sarah Mills and I have been thinking about this show over the past year. It's been something that's been in my head kind of nagging for the last 10 years. And it took the brilliance of Sarah Mills to really bring it to fruition and bring it to you today. I think there's something so interesting about the intermingling of a form that is so tactile, that is known for being haptic, and a form that is sometimes seen as being disembodied. And I think all of the works and all of the artists on this panel really take that to heart and open up new languages and pathways for us to explore. So we will do some of that today. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sarah Mills, who is just the best collaborator anyone could ever dream of. We're going to talk with the artists and ask some questions, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end to have questions from the audience.
Thank you, Ariel. And as I said last night at the opening, this all started with Ariel. This came out of, I think, her thesis work, and it's actually come out of my thesis work. So it was the stars aligned, and it was a perfect marriage of our passions. And we've been working together for so long, and the whole time I've always been on the same page. And as I mentioned again last night, that we think that's because we're coming from different areas in the art world, and we're seeing the same things. And so it just seemed like there's something that was that just is kind of a zeitgeist happening right now in the art world, and something that's making this work very relevant. So what I'm going to do is just talk very briefly. I really want to hear from the artist, and I will just kind of warm you up and set the scene and give you a little bit of historical background on video and craft. This exhibition tells a very uncommon story about the fusion of these forms of video and media technologies. Historically, they have been bifurcated. And I mean, on the one hand, you can kind of follow this logic because craft practices were typically oriented around specific materials like clay and glass, fiber and metal, whereas video art centered on audiovisual space and computer technology. So in form, craft is often very sculptural, physical, tactile, where video and the moving image typically remain planar and screen-based, and they prescribe an immobile, centered viewer. On the other hand, there are well-known gender, race, and class biases that have caused the separation between video and craft. Video, which became part of a discourse of new media studies in the 1970s and 80s, has been repeatedly linked to the historical avant-garde, so Dada, surrealism, and conceptual art. Where craft, on the other hand, has kind of meandered in and out of art history, often being the means to an end, but never really the end goal. The artists in video craft have really shed this past, and they also interrogate it. And what you see in this exhibition, Ariel and I think, is not a wholesale return to old media technologies per se, nor are these artists adopting a futuristic sensibility. And so rather, the media exchanges here ground the viewers in the real, as we understand that real through our senses, embodiment, and awareness of the moment. At some point, we've all plunged our hands into dough, or we've squeezed a chubby baby, and that tactile pleasure, and I would also add tactile knowledge, returns in viewing experiences here. A desire to touch expresses an interest to learn. It's interesting to hypothesize why a strong hapticality and desire to render materiality more intelligible is reemerging now. I think of past examples like Art Brut that comes out of the post-World War II moment, in the work of Jean Dubuffet or Stan Brakhage in the 1950s. His early experimental work was very much about these kind of same tropes you see here. Perhaps tactile awareness is something lost in adulthood or taken for granted as we become more inundated with knowledge based in text and photography. You could also speculate the work in videocraft represents a response to the influx of digital interfaces in our lives. But I also think it's more than that. I think artists' skill sets are more diversified today, and I think they see their ideas sometimes taking fuller forms across media. So in the 1970s, Beryl Carrot and Aaron Marcus, who are right back here anchoring the exhibition in the back, they were taking tools of the hard sciences and they were putting them to work very imaginatively. So they transformed video and computer technologies that were used for data-driven analysis very early on, and they made them into kind of mark-making systems and exploiting the formal beauty and the shared structural language of technologies. It's also noteworthy that they made the decision to create and reveal textures, and in Carrot's case, tie them to horrific human-imposed tragedies. So artists in videocraft follow in the footsteps of Carrot and Marcus. They also engage in a disruption of traditions tied to specific media, as it means to question and reconsider the stories embedded in them. And we'll see that and talk more to Kira about that. Disney movies have often assisted in creating stereotypes, for example, and photo and film histories have made it exceedingly difficult for women to work creatively. So in conceiving videocraft, Ariel and I saw that we needed a new framework. We needed a different way to discuss craft. And we landed on action words, encoded, sampled, and looped. These words characterize information movement. Encoded points to work of structural translation, where a particular process completely alters the form. Looped shows ideas manifested through the union of physical materials, and sample defines artists' mixing of imagery, sometimes imagery used in one media that's borrowed from another. So with that setup, I would like to turn it over to the artist. I would like to pose a few questions, and then we will open it up to hear from you and your questions. But I want to start off very generally with just mentioning how each of you have a very different approach to film, in specifically in this work here. And if you've arrived at it from different spaces, and so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about just your general interests in film and moving image, and how that emerged and how it's evolved. And so, Kelly, I think since you're next to me,
I'll take the mic. Hi, I'm Kelly Egan. I'm a filmmaker. So my relationship to this exhibition is a little bit different, because actually when I was making film quilts originally, no one knew that I had film quilts, they just knew that I had films. So they only saw the film version of what you are seeing here as a quilt and a film. The reason that I married the two, I think I was starting my PhD, and I was reading a lot of écriture féminin, and I was thinking a lot about the way that male structures dominate our world. And so I was wondering what filmmaking, as a structural filmmaker, what filmmaking would mean to me if I thought about it through a feminine lens. And so I started thinking about quilting as a way that women have memorialized their events in their lives. They've celebrated marriages, deaths. It's been a very important part of women's communication. And so I started to make films based on quilt patterns. My films run through projectors. There is nothing that has been done to this film that can't be reversed. They're hand-stitched through perforations. I construct the quilt, then I deconstruct it as a film to get a print so that it can show through a projector, and then I reconstruct it as a quilt. It takes me about 3 years to do this process. Am I missing anything? écriture féminin, women's work, thinking about what craft means, because craft is something that we typically look at as a woman's work, and why that purification, also a purification, I guess. The bifurcation has happened between the craft world and the art world, and specifically why women weren't as celebrated in the structural film world as some of our male counterparts.
Hello. Yeah, so I've been making woven animations for about 15 years, and I think in the beginning, that's my piece right there, the long green weaving. But yeah, in the beginning, I didn't really have a theory or framework for what I was doing. I was just kind of curious what would happen if I scanned in fabric and worked with it digitally. But I think over time, I guess to answer the question, like for me, using video has become sort of this tool to like expand my weaving practice, because I will sort of think about different editing techniques or cinematic concepts and try to figure out how I can, approach those through physical means. So like when an image comes in and out of focus, I try to figure out how I can do that through weave structure. So video has kind of served for me as a framework to generate ideas and expand my practice. And I think over time, I've just kind of been interested in seeking out these connections between the fields of video and textiles, and like this understudied role of women's work within the history of film. And I think that's also sort of expanded how I approach textiles.
Thanks. My work is back here, those three along the wall. So I've always approached textiles as a moving image, as something that's constantly in motion, and that the textile itself is built up of a surface that has an image, but then when you step through, that image has been created through a structure. So rather than sort of imposing an image onto a substrate, you've got the substrate being the image and the substrate sort of doing the work together. The thing that for me was really fascinating was when I came across this article during my thesis work about the unicorn tapestries. So like that famous unicorn in the pen, and this is in the cloisters in New York if you ever want to go visit it. In 1998, they took them down because they wanted to document them, right, photograph them. And they put it in like sterile museum environment. They had a camera hovering over the surface, and they had to take just like thousands of images to sort of like close up document these unicorn tapestries. And when they tried to then take these images and put them together, they realized they couldn't. And so in 2005, they had two mathematicians in a supercomputer try to challenge this problem of why is a textile always in motion that's actually still, and there should be nothing disrupting these like photos from being stitched together, and yet every fiber was moving, the breath of the technician who was taking the camera, just even like the textiles were responding to the bodies who were in that space. And because they were breathing and we were breathing, everything was always in motion. So they described it actually like a textile and an image is like water, and it's slipping through our fingers. And so it took many, many years to them finally develop the technology. They held the film and waited until the technology caught up so they could then piece together those images. And so now we have documentation of the unicorn tapestries. So I thought that was really interesting.
The moving image and textile arts have a very different compositional strategies, and I think those are inherent within the media. And so I'm wondering, could you share a little bit about your thought process around the composition of your work and how it relates to content, the content that we see in your work? I want to talk about process.
I don't know how to answer this question right now. I'm trying to be like, okay, come on, Kelly. So one of the things that was really interesting to me is how much time filmmakers spend with film strips and how little time the audience spends with the film strip. And so it was really important to me to bring the film strip to the audience so that they could partake in the material sort of connection. have some kind of embodied experience of the film as an object as well as it as a projection. I was really taken by Peter Kubelka when he would do talks. He would talk about cooking and he would talk about a whole bunch of other things, but he would also take his film strip and pass it through the audience. So you could actually hold the film strip, which technically a lot of people think is a precious medium. They're very strong. They're meant to go through these whirling machines. And so there is something that is surprising about the film medium because of its strength, because of its ability to transform space and time. And so, just as I said before, with Écriture Féminin, we're thinking about how we could turn filmmaking into a feminine practice. I was really interested in how a quilt would create what the narrative of a quilt would create with a film. And so that's basically what I did. And then the quilts themselves are interesting to look at as well. So it's because my films and my quilts are one-to-one ratios, it's bringing the film to the audience through a different means, through the means that I typically engage with it, through the materiality of the object. I can talk a little bit about Anna Atkins. What would you like to know about Anna Atkins? So Anna Atkins was a woman who lived in Britain and who created cyanotypes. She created a lot of early kind of photography work. She worked a lot with John Herschel and her father as well. And so she created a lot of cyanotypes of areas around her world. So she created British algae cyanotypes. She created British fern cyanotypes. Anywhere that it was sort of an ecological exploration. So anywhere that she went, she created cyanotypes of those areas. Are you wanting me to talk about coding, or are you wanting me to talk about Anna Atkins being erased from the history of photography?
Yes.
Okay, so then when we start thinking about the history of photography, we think about John Talbot Fox, or John Fox Talbot. My brain is not working today, I'm so sorry. East Coast time is still on my mind. I get up at 4:30. So she actually created the first book of photography. Because it wasn't published through a commercial press, it's often not regarded as the first book of photography. It was just given to her friends as well as given to archives and libraries. But it is this unbound text that you can actually change the direction of by changing the movements of the images within inside of it. So it's this really beautiful, very unusual work. And so I was really interested in bringing Anna Atkins back into the history of filmmaking, or back into the history of photographic arts. And so I did dedicate my film to Anna Atkins. I did use her recipe for making cyanotype. There's many different cyanotype recipes out there. I used her recipe for making cyanotype and just added some gelatin so that I could adhere it to the film strip. She's a really wonderful person that has been erased from history. There's a little bit of contemporary word that I can't remember that starts with a C, controversy, thank you, to myself, yes, around Anna Atkins as well, because she was from a wealthy family, which is why she had the ability to use these new materials of photographic arts in the 1800s. Her family owned slaves, so she was a slave owner, or she was, why am I talking about, this is 4:30. She's a little bit more controversial, but at the same time, she didn't actually have any power. She was a woman, she couldn't own anything at that point. Her husband owned everything. Her father owned everything. So there is some controversy about how we should look at her with this new knowledge, but at the same time, if we're thinking about this new knowledge, we can also look at the other men that are also very much a problem in this colonialist world. So I just wanted to make a quilt, make an object of art that did bring her work back into the attention of the general public, and the complexity of looking back. History is a really complex area of study. It's a really complex cultural object, and so it is important to look at the history and all of that history when we start to think about contemporary works. That was really bad.
No, it's great. Yeah, so in terms of composition, I think because most of my work results in two pieces, the weaving and the animation, I'm often thinking of how the composition will read on both works. Most of my weavings kind of look gridded out because I scan the weavings into digital format and those individual squares become frames in the movie image. In this case, I wanted to sort of eliminate the grid. That weaving is made up of individual frames, but I took out the dividing lines so that it kind of read as a continuous pattern. But it is made up of, I think, 8 frames going across the width of the weaving. And then the imagery for this piece is based on overshot weaving patterns, which is a weaving technique that creates these really graphic, almost psychedelic geometric patterns across a plain weave flat ground. And I chose overshot because it shares a very striking resemblance to VHS glitches, and that is because this is something Beryl Korat has talked about. There's a structural connection between VHS technology and weaving with static vertical lines and information running across horizontally. So when I first started making animations, I was really drawn to VHS tapes that had, damaged areas and where you would see that underlying structure appear. And I was kind of struck by how closely those glitches look like overshot weaving patterns. So I made this piece specifically for the show when I heard about the concept of the show, because overshot just always really read to me as a video artifact. And then the last thing I'll say is I painted on the weaving after it came off the loom, just to kind of create another dimension, because the weaving pattern does have this background and foreground, and I wanted to kind of add another tempo and dimension to the animation. I wasn't really concerned about how the color looked on the weaving. I really was thinking about how it would read on the video. So.
Yeah, so composition for me begins really when I'm choosing the thread that I'm going to start cutting and sort of putting on the loom. So to get sort of really nuts and bolts about the way that you compose while weaving is that you have a loom, which is literally any 2 poles that can be held in tension with one another, so a counter tension. And you're putting threads and you're sort of winding it around those poles or those sticks or those nails. And so I have this sort of like first step example that you're invited to interact with on 2 of the pieces, where you can feel that motion that I sort of start with the thread that's doing this kind of figure 8 looping. And then the way that those threads then build up, both like across sort of parallel to one another and then intersecting perpendicularly to one another, is the way that the image then emerges. And for me, it is kind of magic still. Like, I can't necessarily anticipate what's going to happen as far as that image, how the image is built up. I can have a narrative story in my mind. I can have a relationship, literally sort of like stretching my fingers and the tips of my fingers along the threads. And the sort of amount of warp, so those ends that line up on the loom next to each other, it's the equivalent of me walking the length of a mile or 2 miles or 3 miles, doing this motion over and over and over again. And so, I mean, when you do that, you are sort of building up so much time with the material and so much sort of experience of that touch, that then you kind of understand, okay, how are they going to perform when they're on a loom and being asked to kind of move and do this dance with the other threads around them, and then this dance of my body at the loom sort of moving with that material. And then the colors that I'm choosing and sort of moving through these warp strands as they go, suddenly an image appears. And I can sort of start maybe recognize certain things of, oh, that's a shape. There's the number 2. That looks kind of like a clockwork. And this kind of motion then, again, for me, has been a motion of composition that I've had a lot of experience with throughout my life. My first job was as a projectionist at a movie theater when they had actual physical 35mm film. And that motion, the reason why I got that job at 16 was because I knew how to do that on a sewing machine. And it's exactly the same motion of incremental tension points, of threads doing this kind of dance through a machine that's held on these 2 points of tension, and how that allows things to keep moving and threading, and suddenly we get an image.
Can I add one thing to just kind of piggyback off of what Kira was saying? Is textile history and film and video history has always been interlinked. Actually, the first film substrate, which is celluloid, was made by accident when a cotton rag was used to mop up a nitrate spill, and the cotton rag stiffened and became almost plasticized. So that term celluloid refers to this early form of plastic that was formed with cotton fibers. Secondly, in terms of thinking about video and how Kate was talking about glitches, there's a term called interlacing, which is specific to VHS and video. And it's when the images of video, there's two images that are in diagonal lines on VHS tape. And when they don't line up, it creates, those glitches are like an analog failure in the videotape, which is amazing. So this term interlacing that responds to glitches in VHS tape is also so of the language of the textile world. So there's always been these kind of interlocking verbiages and languages, spools, reels, all of these things kind of tie together.
Video art is defined as time-based media. That's how I've understood it through all the museums that collect it. But it's interesting to think about the tactile experience of things as something about time and how the body is required to really feel and inspect things, move around them. Particularly in craft, there's been a strong history of that. So I'm wondering, each of you kind of deal with duration and viewer experience in your work. Kira's work is interactive to participatory, and that's something I've actually never seen before with weaving and contemporary art. And duration, I think, is very different when you talk about a quilt and looking at film through a quilt. And so, I was wondering if you and Kate, decisions around duration are also interesting to me too. Maybe, if you could each talk about that.
I don't like being first. It doesn't give me time to think. I had so many answers after everyone else spoke. So duration, I think about duration in size. So I look at the quilts that I make and I think about, okay, that's about 5 minutes. Okay, that's about 4 minutes. So I look at Jennifer West's quilt there, that would be about 2 minutes. So size becomes a really important aspect of my process, but I didn't mention this before. When I'm looking at the film strip itself, it usually tells me what kind of body it wants to take on. So with this film, my body was very involved in the process of making it, so my body also helped with the duration because I was hand coating the film strip myself, so I can only coat things that are the width of my arms. It took about 3 days total to make 24 seconds of that film. So duration is also very much part of the process of making the work. So when it comes to time, when thinking about that, it is very much an embodied experience that I'm thinking about when I'm making my pieces. And I'm looking at the actual film strip and thinking about what kind of traditional quilt pattern would match the content of the film strip itself. So the thing that I think you wanted me to mention before was I found this film in the garbage that had a little girl being bullied by boys that had a spider in a jar. And so I thought that was a perfect thing to represent Anna Atkins and her challenges when it came to photography or becoming represented as a photographer. Yeah, I think that's it. Time, space, arms.
I guess I also, when it comes to duration, think about the labor. I think about it very physically. Like, I animate at 6 frames per second, and so oftentimes one row is 6 frames going across the width of the loom, and so that takes about 2 hours or 3 hours to physically weave it, and so that's 1 second of film. So a lot of times I create shorter works that are on loops. This thing just kind of ballooned out of control and just kept going. I used an industrial loom too, so most of my labor was in the painting. But I think in terms of just like the topic of viewership, I always also want to think about not necessarily how long it takes, but like the textural qualities. Like I want to kind of leave the eye on the surface, but then have moments where they're kind of invited into sort of the depth of a scene, but then pushed back out. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a lot I can sort of frame this thinking about time, and one way I want to think about it is in terms of Greg's work here with the quilts too, is taking sort of like one moment, right? Like one moment of history and extending it out so long that you can sit with that moment for 5 years or for however many years. You want to sort of like sit with and make and revisit and sort of allow your own spirit experience to bleed in. So you've got like, I feel like textiles allows us to layer time in a really strange way. So that a lot of like what I think about with duration is that really what you're doing is almost visceralizing time so that you can feel it in your body and in your senses in a way that we can take something in so fast with our eyes. And for me, that really goes back to the way that I sort of grew up with textiles, that they were the storytelling mechanism, that they were what sort of a lot of immigrant families can relate to this of like what my people were able to bring with them. And so then when it was like sitting with my grandma, sitting with my aunts, it's like unpacking and telling the stories through textiles. And so being able to do that then for me at the loom with weaving, when I'm sort of like inviting a viewer into this experience, how do I extend that story, extend that time? So I'm literally bringing hundreds of years into like one moment that we're all sitting with this piece.
Ariel, do you have any questions? Any more questions or comments?
I have a million questions, but maybe we should shoot it over to the audience. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can hand mics off too. Any immediate questions? The intrepid first person to break the silence.
I am just totally in awe of your process, and I would love to sort of like, I don't know if you could like walk me through it just like a little more like slowly, because I don't know if I'm quite capturing, like when you say you look at that and you're like, oh, that's 2 minutes of film. What are you like doing with your eyes as you look at that to take it apart to be like, okay, I understand why that's 2 minutes.
Just the size of it. Let's talk to each other like this. We can both have microphones. Just because of my film, okay, so my film is a film, so I start with the left side going down, and then I take the next strip and I attach it to that bottom piece, and then the next one to the bottom piece there, and so it becomes a film like that. I'm sending it through a printer, yes, at 24 frames per second. So I start to be able to see how long 24 frames per second is. I don't know what it is in 35, but in 16, it's 1 foot is 40 frames. So you start to think about time based on space. Does that help?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
When you like see, like when you found that in the
garbage. Yes.
Like, and you saw that like laid out as film strips, were you like, okay?
It was in a reel.
Okay.
So.
But then when you're like laying it, like, so
Yeah.
you're like, okay, 1 foot is how long? 40 frames?
40 frames for 16. Yeah.
And that's how long?
That's like a little less than 2 seconds.
2 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're like laying this out and you're like, okay, I've got like 3 minutes worth of like footage here.
Well, my films are very difficult to watch because they don't have a narrative, because they're very structural, and because I use animated sound a lot of the time, and animated sound is something that people don't know how to respond to. And so I make short films because I know you can sit through 5 minutes of something. So if sitting through 5 minutes of something and making something about that large that can travel, that's good.
Yeah, it is good.
That's 5 minutes is good. Yeah. I have a smaller one. I don't know how I feel about it. Yeah.
I have a question about the challenges of showing and documenting a medium that, you know, both fiber and video, I feel like have challenges in kind kind of modern spaces for art. And I'm curious how you all have thought about, I guess, like that kind of final representation of like the sum total of all your thoughts, and how, you know, I guess if anything, what wishes you may have for just like the entirety of the art world to adapt to better accommodate, like whether it's fiber art, video art, or that kind of like the space between that you guys are trying to hold. And whether even in putting together the show, maybe, you know, the curators want to speak to how they were thinking about that, and like what opportunities you all see even going forward in your practices.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, yeah, that was my initial thought. I'm like, I feel like with shows like this, sometimes as an artist, I get confused where it's like, okay, this is the exhibition, and then I have documentation afterwards. Where really, I feel like it's physical spaces like this where people can gather, where we can see art, where we can see it in conversation with one another. That is sort of the history that we are creating in the present moment that goes forward. Like, it's so important to have these physical kind of gathering spaces versus I experience a lot of these artworks on my phone, very small, and it's not the same sort of experience, especially if what I understand a textile to be is something that's appealing to all of my senses, and even then the materiality of a moving image, that there's that sort of material underlying substrate that's acting on all of my body. And so it's really important, I think. I'm just so grateful to these curators to sort of understand that we're documenting a moment here in our history, just being able to like have this kind of exhibition.
I don't know if this is answering the question, but I think one challenge I face is just trying to figure out how to display both pieces, because on the one hand, the weaving can stand alone, but it's also like an artifact of the video, which I think is the case for a lot of artists in the show. So I never understand if it makes sense to have them side by side for the viewer to kind of make those connections, or if it's just too much information. I don't know if that's kind of not, that's a specific thing, but, and I don't know what I wish for the art world. I'll have to think on that, but, and I do wish, I've been going to a bunch of film festivals, and I do wish there were more corresponding exhibitions, because I think more and more filmmakers are working with physical materials, and there's all these festivals and there's no exhibition space to show those things.
I have a bit of a different answer, and I think that one of the most important aspects of exhibitions like this, and personally me coming from a very small town, is the community and the collective response. And so the fact that there are so many people, I'm not going to say women, there are so many people working in this way, working with these mediums, working with this duration, this process-based, this hand-making film and video. I think that's really important, and I really appreciate the camaraderie, meeting people and being able to talk about these things, because it's a small community, and it's a really wonderful community. So. Oh, you got whatever.
Okay, I just want to respond to this really quickly, because I think when Ariel and I first met, we're like, yes, we see the same thing happening. We're talking about the same things, but we were like, this can't be about video, this can't be about, we were trying to break out of categories, and it was really tough. And I think that was like a big goal for us, was that we wanted to talk about the haptic, we wanted to talk about intermediate relationships. And I mean, for the past 10 years, I've run into weavers who are like, I'm tired of being in a textile show. Like, can I be in a show of contemporary art? It's not about, a soft, pliable form. And so I think it was just really a kind of beautiful harmonization that, we're both interested in process and structural languages. And I think, too, it was something we really worked hard to do, was to find a language because I've seen shows in the art world, and they've been great, and you see curators trying to pull in new media, and they're doing it through what they know best, which is formal analysis and visual. This is a grid, and we're organizing things by, it's cubular or gridded, and I think that's great. But I think I think we really try to break out of that too, and talk more about what's happening behind the scenes and what's the kind of structural language. So if more of that can happen, hopefully it'll stick.
Yeah.
You know.
I'll just add that I think in planning this exhibition, when I would say, oh, it's called Videocraft, people were shocked when I showed them the checklist, and it was mostly objects. There's a lot of video here, but it's predominantly, physical objects that we had to bring from all over the world to get here. So I think that's something, that tangibility and that hapticness was something that tied us in our thinking together from the start, just something that is a full experience. And I think that is what people are hungry for, and that's why an exhibition like this works.
My question is probably for all of you. I was sort of curious how many of the artists in the show were aware of each other's work prior to the show, or whether your curation is sort of what brought these people together. I'm just curious about the interweaving, to use that word, of influence on each other and how kind of siloed people are in this practice or not. That's my question.
Do we want to start with Kate?
Sure, yeah, I know everybody. I stalk them all on Instagram. And I think we've been in some shows together, right? There was a show called Interlaced, that a lot of us were in New Zealand, curated by a scholar who studies like animation and video and textiles. But it feels like a very niche. Like there are a few artists I hadn't heard of, but for the most part, I am very familiar with all of them.
Sabrina and I went to grad school together. We were friends. It was nice. We got to talk about sticking needles in plastic. There is this community. I've heard of Kate. I hadn't met Kate before, but I'd heard of Kate. Ala was like, you have to meet Kate. And I've met Kira for the first time over Instagram and email lately, and I've just been so impressed with your work and how eloquent, how you can speak. How speaking good.
Thanks, Kelly. That's a great question. So similar, like Danielle's work here is in the back corner. She would have wished to be here today. She and I were at grad school together. We had studios next to one another, so that's when I got to know Danielle. And now we're colleagues. We both teach weaving at SAIC in Chicago. Kate, I feel like, has been an icon in the textile world. You can't take a textile class in any program across this country without sort of being introduced to Kate's work almost immediately. It's so true. Just because of the ways that you pushed sort of beyond the sort of not to discount the rectangular frame, but transforming that rectangular frame to mean more than it is just related to painting or it is just related to tapestry on the wall. Like, what else can this sort of frame allow for on the loom, and then afterwards with the textile to sort of create other ways of seeing it. You're really amazing at it, so. Yeah.
Great question. Any more? Yeah.
I wanted to know how you discovered your process and what was it like refining it?
I'm a cameraless filmmaker, so I was really influenced by brackage. I was also doing a lot of collage work, which included using a lot of adhesive sprays and a lot of rubber cement, which is very yummy, but very bad for you. So I was making a film called Marry Me, and I was thinking about whether or not it was worth dying for my art, and I decided it was not. It was definitely not worth dying for my art. So my art wasn't good enough, is what I thought. So I started thinking about ways of creating films that didn't involve dangerous substances, and so I started thinking about sewing. So I started thinking about crafting together, stitching together films through literal stitches. And now I forgot the question. Then I looked at a lot of Joyce Whelan's work. So Joyce Whelan made this one thing called confederation. It's a cross in between confederation and bedspread. can't say the word. And it is a piece of plastic that has little pouches and little stuffed in it. It's basically a stuffed piece of plastic. And I looked at that and I said, that's a film. That's a film quilt. And I wanted to start thinking about ways of creating structural films, again, as I said before, that were through women's work or through women's practices. And so I was really interested in creating quilts as films. So my practice really does come from touching the materials, from thinking about the materials, from seeing the materials, and from deciding what the materials want to be.
So I was working as an office manager at a usability startup firm in San Francisco in the early 2000s, and my boss wanted a video made to explain the software that we created. And I used these like cutout felt people and scanned them in. That was the first time I had to learn iMovie and animated. And I just remember, it's online, but I remember zooming in really closely to the furry, cheap felt. And I was just kind of blown away. And just to see textiles so close, it was like looking through a microscope or something, and then like making it move was really exciting. And then at the same time, I had been taking classes at SF State, and just like anything we learned, I just started scanning in. So like I have some early animations where it's like shibori dyed fabric, and then I have some quilted animations, and then, all of those things were made frame by frame by frame. So then when I actually started to weave animations, I was shocked at how fast it was, because I could I could actually create 6 frames at the same time, Yeah.
Awesome, thanks for the question. I have always sort of been drawn to textiles. My first memory is of broken twill and herringbone patterns on our couch as a kid. And I had my first sewing machine at 10, saved up, started my little sewing business, and had a serger at 12. So I've always been just like very crafty, and never really took it seriously. Went to college, studied comparative literature at a time in the 90s when sort of post-colonial theory and critical studies was like just sort of taking over the literature world, and I loved it. I thought it was this great sort of way to talk about identity and family experience, but didn't necessarily resonate with me fully. Living here in the States between, different family members, it was like, this isn't quite explaining the experience. And so it was a number of years later, so I had a t-shirt printing business, I had all kinds of random jobs, and it was many years later, I was living in Argentina with my family. I had 2 young kids at that time, and encountered weavers there, and I started hanging out with weavers, dropped my kids off at preschool, and was like, and they were like, oh, well, you know what you're doing already, like, come, like, we can talk, but you better be cleaning wool while we talk, and you better be spinning wool while we talk, and it's like, okay. So it was fun, and then I realized, okay, this is actually a material critical studies, what I'm doing right now. So what I'd learned through all the kind of like reading of books, now I'm hearing stories and understanding there is an embodied knowledge that's being passed along here, and it's just through the relationship, it's through sharing a lot of tea, it's through like spinning a lot of yarn, cleaning a lot of yarn, dyeing a lot of yarn, putting it on the loom, and realizing they're telling me their sort of whole story of what it is to represent identity positions that don't really feel like their own in this moment. So all the details are totally different between their life and my life, and suddenly I'm like, through the loom, through your mother's loom, through your grandmother's loom, I get it. I actually have textiles too, that I've been told the stories over and over and over. And now this is the kind of embodied knowledge that I want to like share. And so when I got back to the States, I'm like, where can I do this as a job? I'm like, contemporary art. You have fiber feminists that have always come into the craft world and used craft as a way to sort of make inroads and tell stories that people weren't ready for, but that they actually were. And so I felt very fortunate to be able to land in graduate school and in contemporary art, and to be able to sort of tell these stories through materials in a way that, that allowed me to actually make a job out of it. So, yeah.
Thank you. This is a great talk and conversation and an amazing show. I'm curious, we're speaking about Anna Atkinson, and then of course that also made me think about science and natural science, which then again makes me think about Suzanne Simard, which makes me think about communication systems, or rooted internet under the soil. And all of you have talked about structure, and I'm thinking about, and you mentioned, you know, we're in this very particular moment in time now, physically in space together. Legacy is being made as we sit. And so I'm just thinking about those kinds of things and what the interconnections may be, and if they're at all of interest to any of you.
We can maybe start with just thinking through our terms that kind of are the overarching themes of the show. We didn't want to make those clear sections or anything, but we've kind of grouped artists into these terms of encoded, looped, and sampled. And all of those terms come from new media discourse, but I think they're very easily applied to craft discourses as well. And so that's kind of an information subsystem that runs throughout the show. And just on the surface level, the object labels all have little icons in the bottom that can hint at which section or which kind of theme we would put this work in, but are not necessarily true or tied and true. So there is kind of a system of information that's running here. I would also point back to Aaron Marcus in the show, who was a really early adopter of user interface design. He was working in the 1970s creating computer graphics. And once we discovered his work, which there is a archive of at Letterform Archive, which is just across the street from here, we really saw this grounding of the entire show in both his work and its conversation with Beryl Karat. So I think that kind of maybe answers your question, but there is this kind of system that has sprung up from the 1970s that is still being spoken to and answered with today.
It's a beautiful question. I don't have anything to add, but I'll probably after we leave.
I just want to talk about iron. So this is a cyanotype, and a lot of motion picture is based on silver. When it comes to video, different kinds of natural resources are used for that. But I was really drawn to the idea of creating films with iron-based substances, because iron is so part of our body, it's so part of our world, it's part of the structures that surround us, but we don't necessarily see it, we don't necessarily think about it. When we think about silver, we automatically start to thinking about relationships with monetary systems, we start to think about value, we start to think about engagement rings, we start to think about all of these other aspects of the world. So I do think that there is something really interesting about the way that we are investigating materials and processes that does relate to communication systems, new communication systems, thinking about systems outside of the world, and whether or not science and art are actually separate, period. If that answers your question at all.
Sorry. What Kelly just said inspired this. We were thinking about this beyond the textile, because there have been shows that have examined video, animation, and textiles, as we called out, interlaced in New Zealand, but we were thinking about this beyond that. And something that I kept thinking about was clay's relationship to video and to film. And there is this way in which we can automatically think about claymation in that sense, because claymation and film has always been kind of a medium. We did not want to stick to that, and instead I started thinking about the way that clay is processed and how that is similar to how film is processed, in that it goes under a transformation based on either light or heat in the case of clay, where it completely transforms from one chemical structure to another. And so, particularly in Lauren Common's work, which is kind of at the center of where we're all sitting, she takes these works, engages her body in them while it's wet, and then fires them in this way that it still looks as if they're wet, and as if it could still crunch or squish or kind of be malleable under her weight. And something about that transformation, I think, between both clay as a body becoming something new through the chemistry of heat, and through film, through light, becoming something new. I think there's a connection there.
One more thing I'll add to that is just, I really loved this question. I was just at a conference last week in Dartmouth, and we were thinking about, it was with a lot of architects and engineers, and they were thinking about shape grammars and the way that notation then has been is captured within weaving drafts or within textiles. That's also similar in other any kind of embodied or image-based knowledge system that isn't then written down, but then maybe has shape instructions, can create a whole different way of language. And then creates a whole different way of learning, which creates a whole different way of making. And so it's this kind of question of, I'm thinking about Nagundi's work right behind us, because the loom passes information in this way that has this very direct relationship to also the way music notation was translated into these self-playing pianos that also instructed the way that computers were initially encoded with these punch cards. What happens if we start to imagine okay, well, what's a different way of passing information? And how does that start having this ripple effect that changes all the technology moving forward? And so it's more of a speculative question of because we're so based in some ways off of this passing of information and this configuration. I love this punch card exhibit behind me. How else do we pass information, and how does that change the tools we have going forward and connections that we have?
Great thought. Do we have one more final question? Okay, I'm also happy to leave it at that. I thought that was a great question. Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for coming. And please thank Kira Dominguez Hultgren, Kate Nartker, and Egan.